Okay, so next up, we have John Lustrea. John is the Education Director of the National Civil War Medicine Museum. I'm sorry. And I'll let John tell us a little bit more about that. I used to live in the Frederick, Maryland area, and I saw when they were first building this. And it's an awesome museum. If you ever get a chance to visit, I certainly recommend it. Frederick's a pretty cool little place too. So, and he can tell you more about it. John, thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. Like Steve said, I'm John Lustrea. I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, just down in Frederick, Maryland. So not quite in Pennsylvania, but we're close. We're within spitting distance. And today I'm going to be talking about sort of the story of Civil War medicine, which features pretty heavily Pennsylvanian Jonathan Letterman. Which we'll get to in just a moment. But if you like what I have to say, you can find us obviously physically in Frederick, Maryland, but you can find us on the web as well. Our website is civilwarmed.org. Or you can find us on YouTube, where we have a pretty active presence. We do one video a week up there. I just did a live stream today. Talking about Black prisoners of war in the Confederate South. Next week, we're doing a program about wounded Union soldiers at the Battle of South Mountain. So we stay pretty active on our YouTube channel. Again, just go to YouTube, you type in National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And likewise, we're also pretty active on Facebook as well. Again, National Museum of Civil War Medicine or Civil War Med or anything like that, and you'll find us in all those places. So if you like what I have to say and you want to learn more, you can check out our website, civilwarmed.org, our YouTube channel, or the Facebook page, or of course, come visit us. We're open currently Thursday through Sunday for walk-ins during irregular hours, but you can also come Monday through Wednesday if you make an appointment. So that's how to get in touch with us if you're curious. And of course, if you have any questions for me specifically, obviously you can ask them at the end of the program, but you can also contact me via Steve if you just have a burning question that you have to ask and you weren't able to attend live or you forgot, you thought of it later or whatever. So tonight, or whenever you're watching this, I'll take you through sort of the story of Civil War medicine. And so when I think most people think about Civil War medicine, to the extent that you do spend time thinking about Civil War medicine, if you're a nerd like me, you sit there and amputations, scenes like what you're seeing right now tend to sort of come to mind. Nobody's washing their hands. It's pretty grim, gruesome, lots of disease, and really at the end of the day, you're just glad that you live in the 21st century when it comes to medical care. And by and large, that's true. There's a lot to be said for that. But what I'm hopefully going to do here is maybe complicate that image a little bit as we go. Well, to start off, let's start before the Civil War here. So what did the doctors know going into the Civil War? If you're going to medical school before the Civil War, what sort of things are you learning? Well, you are learning about, and this is another kind of common thought that comes to mind for some folks when it comes to Civil War medicine. You think about using leeches to bleed people, cupping, what we call the heroic era of medicine. And that's something they would have learned in medical school, but in the 1840s and 50s, it was kind of on its way out. What was on its way in was intensive study of anatomy. And it's worth noting, actually, since you guys are so Pennsylvania focused, Pennsylvania Postal History Society, Philadelphia was the premier center for medical learning on the eve of the Civil War, especially Jefferson Medical College, and there were others, but the Philadelphia was the place if you wanted to get an A1 medical education. Of course, there were medical schools all around the country, but Philadelphia in particular was the place. That and Boston, but Philadelphia especially. So they are learning about this heroic era of medicine, leeches and things that, that's in the curriculum, but the focus is on anatomy. They have a Civil War surgeon would have a pretty clear understanding of where all the human bone, or where all the bones in the body, where all the organs are, and pretty much what they all do. What they don't learn in medical school is they don't learn about germ theory because it hasn't been discovered yet. So as I go through this, just bear in mind, no one is really washing their hands with any degree of regularity or at all. So they just don't quite know about germ theory. One thing, though, that was discovered before the Civil War, and what you see pictured here, is anesthesia. And the image here, anesthesia is discovered 1846 or 47, I can never remember. But this painting depicts the first operation done under anesthesia, ether in this case. And it's a total game changer, of course, for the medical field. Suddenly, surgeries become not about speed, but about precision. And that's a huge shift. And by the time the Civil War comes around, anesthesia was pretty widely accepted and becomes the rule in the Civil War. And if you take nothing away from what I say tonight, remember this fun fact, and I'll harp on this more later, but 95% of all Civil War surgeries used anesthesia, chloroform and ether. That's anesthesia is the rule and not the exception. And it's because it had been around for a while. It was something that the doctors were very, very well aware of. Now, again, something else they're not learning about in medical school, or it's not whether they're learning or not, but something that the doctors don't do a whole lot of is dissection. And that's because dissection was primarily done exclusively on the bodies of executed criminals, because it was thought if there was not a physical body to be raised up at the end of times, then there would be no afterlife for said individuals. So dissection was thought of sort of as like a second death. And so because of that, there's not a lot of bodies available. Now, of course, if you're going to perform surgery, or if a doctor is going to perform surgery on you, ideally, you would like the first time that they have done surgery not to have been on you. You want them to have done this before. And that's, partially why, dissecting cadavers is so important for those in medical school. But there's sort of a complicated issue here. There's just not a lot of bodies to go around. And so what frequently medical schools would turn to was grave robbing or body snatching. And they would go to the local cemeteries and dig up bodies and have the students dissect those. Now, of course, you can imagine that that was not a wildly popular practice with the local civilian population. And because of this, there were about 18 different anatomy riots that we know about before the Civil War, which is to say local populace storms the local medical school and in some cases burns it completely to the ground. So being a doctor or in medical school before the Civil War could at times be sort of a dicey proposition. And this is just one of the reasons why sometimes doctors were looked upon with some degree of suspicion. So this is the world that the doctors who go on to serve as surgeons in the Civil War, this is the world they come up in. So when the Civil War breaks out, what's their first task? Then as now, to get in the Army, you need to pass a physical exam. And the Civil War surgeons, that's their first task. And by the way, when I use the term surgeon, it's pretty interchangeable at least at the time of the Civil War. Surgeon and doctor are more or less synonymous. Not all surgeons perform surgery, but all doctors are surgeons, or something like that, or maybe the other way around. But anyway, if you hear me use that term a lot, that's why they're basically synonymous. So the surgeons perform physical exams. Now today, there's some similarities with physicals that you take today, and there are plenty of differences. Similarities, they do a pretty good job of screening out, physical challenges that would prevent you from being a soldier. So if you're obviously missing an arm or a leg, they'll screen you out right away. But even if you're missing a toe, they'll screen you out, knowing how much marching the soldiers have to do. If you're missing your index finger on your right hand or your trigger finger, you'll be screened out straight away. What they're not so good about screening out are, if you have recurring diseases, or if you're especially susceptible to this, disease A, B, or C, that's just not very front of their mind. And of course, at the time of the Civil War, they only have one vaccine available to them, and that's the smallpox vaccine. And that was required for Civil War armies, but it was not always enforced. There's no real kind of vaccination cards. Everything about a soldier's personal medical history, there's no records. So they just say, well, yeah, I've had this done. And the doctors basically just sort of have to take their word for it. And at times, there were some disastrous consequences for that, which leads me to my next point: the most dangerous place you could be if you're a Civil War soldier, and that is camp. And that is because of all Civil War deaths, 2/3 come as a result of disease. So 750,000 deaths in the Civil War, that's both Union and Confederate. Of all those 750,000 deaths, 2/3 come as a result of disease. So purely by the numbers, and you need to qualify this a little bit, of course, but by the numbers, you're statistically more likely to die sitting in camp than you are on the battlefield. Now, that depends what sort of fighting you see, and you'd certainly feel better sitting in camp than you would having somebody shooting at you, but just purely based on the numbers, this is more deadly. Now, that has to do with a number of factors. Everyone's living obviously quite close together. So if one person gets sick, it's very easy for that to spread. Nobody's cleaning themselves with any degree of regularity. There's, very vague rules, or at least I should say vaguely enforced rules about, where soldiers are supposed to go to the bathroom. It's kind of a free-for-all. And add on top of that, the fact that a lot of the soldiers who fight in the Civil War are from rural areas where they were not living in as close contact with people as soldiers from the city were. So they didn't build up all of these immunities to these, childhood diseases like, the measles and the mumps, etc. And so they, especially in the early days of the Civil War, they spread like wildfire through some of these new units. And it just decimates the fighting strength of some of these units. Add on top of that, a soldier's diet. A soldier's diet consists largely of hardtack, which is 6 parts flour, 1 part water. You can make it at home. It's not very good, but you can do that if you would like. Hardtack, some sort of salted meat of sorts, beans, maybe some bread or cornbread or something along those lines, and coffee. Notably absent is a consistent, regular application of fresh produce. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that not a single Civil War soldier ever ate a fruit or vegetable in their life. There just wasn't a consistent method for them to regularly get fresh produce in their diet. What they did have was something called desiccated vegetables, which is about as appetizing as it sounds. It's a sort of dehydrated, canned brick of vegetable, amalgam, mush stuff. And the instructions were that you should prepare it as a soup and boil it for 3 hours. Well, first of all, which actively campaigning soldier has 3 hours to sit down and make themselves some nutritious soup? And second of all, when you boil vegetables, and the longer you cook them, the more of the nutrients that you kind of take out of them. So it's sort of the least healthy way to consume vegetables. And on top of that, by all accounts that we have, they tasted horrific. And the soldiers derisively referred to them as desecrated vegetables. So not wildly popular, and it's not quite scratching this sort of nutritious itch that is needed for these soldiers. So their nutrition is not really what it should be. And because of this, even the soldiers and civilians and such were even sort of aware of this problem. There was a great sanitary commission fundraising drive where the slogan was, don't send your soldier, or don't send your loved one a letter, send them an onion. So they're aware of this need to get produce to the front lines. Just the issue with the Civil War is it's fought on such a gargantuan scale that the militaries, both militaries, were just not quite prepared. They didn't have the infrastructure to, facilitate that. Now, what happens if you do get sick in one of these camps, as people will inevitably do? And I forgot to mention that, the most deadly disease of the American Civil War is diarrhea and dysentery. Sees about 50,000 deaths during the Civil War combined between both sides. A very, very low mortality rate. Basically everybody, millions of soldiers suffered from that during the conflict. Only 50,000 deaths. I say only, but relatively low mortality rate compared to typhoid fever, which much fewer people suffered from, but had a much higher mortality rate, somewhere in the 30% range. So, diarrhea and dysentery, largest total number of deaths. Something like gangrene, which had about a 50% mortality rate, was more deadly. So what happens when you do get sick? Well, every morning in any Civil War regiment, the attached surgeon would hold a sick call. And you would say, I'm feeling X, Y, or Z, and they would prescribe for you some medicine. Now, the medicine of Civil War medicine, sort of kind of a mixed bag. There's some good stuff, some bad stuff, and some sort of in the middle. The good news, the good medicine, if you have malaria during the Civil War, you would be prescribed quinine. I'm a historian by trade, not a medical professional. I don't know why it works. It's ground up South American tree bark. It's effective at preventing malaria or curing malaria, and it's still in malaria medications today. So if you have malaria during the Civil War, that can be treated effectively. The opposite side of that, mercury is prescribed liberally during the Civil War. There's thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of doses of mercury, hundreds of thousands likely of mercury that are given out during the conflict, which is, of course, not as helpful. And then sort of in the middle there, a lot of opium-based medications. In the Union Army alone, there's 10 million doses of opium that are given, morphine and such. So if you've been shot, that's good. But of course, as we know, opium is quite addictive. And so in the years after the Civil War, there's an opium addiction crisis. So the one that we're grappling with today, it's not the first opium addiction crisis we've had in American history. It's different in many ways than what was the case immediately after the Civil War. Opium was just available over the counter. So that was probably going to come about with or without the Civil War, but the Civil War accelerates that. But if you've just been shot, they're actually relatively good about pain management during the Civil War. So that's the sort of the medicine side of Civil War medicine. So thus far, I've sort of been telling a kind of depressing story. They didn't know about germ theory. There's all these diseases. The medicines are just kind of so-so. It's been pretty bleak so far. It's going to get a little bit worse before it gets better, but we're going to start turning this around real quick here. And that happens with battlefield medicine. That's where Civil War medicine starts to shine. But it doesn't start that way. Battle First Bull Run, first major battle of the Civil War, it's apparent immediately that something needs to change. At the start of the Civil War, there was no ambulance corps, which seems sort of preposterous to us today. There was no system in place to get wounded soldiers from the battlefield and into a hospital. And because of this, the Battle of First Bull Run, 5,000 casualties. Many soldiers lie on the battlefield for 5 to 7 days waiting for medical care. It's a disaster. I mean, it couldn't be worse. So clearly something needs to happen. Enter Jonathan Letterman, the most important person that many people have never heard of. And he's one of Pennsylvania's finest, born in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, in the southwest corner of the state. Jonathan Letterman, well, first of all, he creates the ambulance corps, which is, goes on to become a hugely important thing. But he also thinks about it more broadly. He's the medical director of the Union Army of the Potomac. And he creates an entire system of care that's designed to care for wounded soldiers from the moment they're injured all the way through long-term recovery. Um, Now, the Ambulance Corps, I should note, first debuts at the Battle of Antietam, um, fought a little bit over a year after the Battle of First Bull Run. It's the bloodiest single day in American history, 23,000 casualties in a single day, and every single casualty is off the battlefield within the first 24 hours after the battle. So it's night and day. The Ambulance Corps improves upon the previous system dramatically. It took 5 to 7 days to to evacuate 5,000 wounded, 23,000 wounded in basically 48 hours. So we're talking hours instead of days to getting wounded soldiers off the battlefield. But the system of care that Letterman comes up with is just as much a vital part of that whole process. And it starts with the field dressing station, which is what you see depicted here in this Harper's Weekly sketch. A field dressing station, and now you're going to hear me say ideally quite a bit over the next little bit. And as we all know, Civil War battles or any mass casualty situation is far from ideal. But I'm going to say ideally, so you know what it's sort of supposed to look like, and the surgeons adapt as needed. So ideally, a field dressing station is supposed to be fairly close behind the front lines, such that if you're wounded, you don't have to go very far to get medical care. But it should ideally be in a sheltered location, such that if you make it there, you shouldn't be, you should be in less danger than you would have been if you were just a little bit away on the front lines. So it should be sheltered and quite close to the front lines. Now, once there, the surgeons at the field dressing station have two main jobs. Number one, and most importantly, is stop the bleeding. And they're doing that with tourniquets and bandages that they're carrying in their portable medical kits, which you can see, so sort of a backpack situation, which you can see on that soldier in the middle's back. He's got the portable medical kit, and that itself is sort of impressive. It's a sort of portable first aid kit. Today we have first aid kits, in offices and schools and rooms, everywhere. But the Civil War sort of really begins that portable nature. They're bringing the medicine to the front lines. This is an early application of that in American history. So the field dressing kits have bandages, tourniquets, morphine, some alcohol, which they would think of as a stimulant, something to give the wounded soldier a little jolt. That kind of burning sensation would be a jolt, to kind of help them with shock. That's how they're thinking of it back then. So you'd have things like that in there. So once the bleeding has been stopped, you've checked your most important box. And number two, their next job is to perform triage. This is the first time that triage has been instituted in United States history in an official way. And they don't call it triage, but they're prioritizing the wounded based on the severity of the injury. Now, today, we prioritize head and chest injuries because we want your brain, your heart, and your lungs to function, in order to keep you functioning. At the time of the Civil War, despite advances with anesthesia and such, their lack of knowledge about germ theory inhibits them to be consistently effective with invasive surgeries. So that's not to say they don't attempt any during the Civil War, but they don't regularly do them. It's a pretty small number. So they're going to prioritize those with limb injuries because they can do the most to help those people. We'll pick that story up in just a second. From the field dressing station, the patients get to the next step of the Letterman plan via the ambulances of the Ambulance Corps, which were supposed to wait by the field dressing station. And you can see that in the sketch there. You have an ambulance in the background. This is still seen today. This is a great kind of one-to-one parallel between Civil War medicine and us today. If you ever go to, if you can remember what large gatherings are like, if you ever find yourself in, large outdoor thing, county fair or a sporting event or outdoor concert or whatever, oftentimes you'd see the white medical tent with the Red Cross right next to it. You see an ambulance. That's directly from the mind of Pennsylvanian Jonathan Letterman. And we still do it today because it's a great idea. If you're hurt, you might need to go to the hospital quickly. So let's put those two things together. The ambulance by the receiving station. And that gets its start during the Civil War and still in use today. Now, from the field dressing station, we head to the field hospital. And this is an image from one of our museum galleries on the about the field hospital. These were ideally about a mile or two behind the front lines, such that you don't have to go, again, you don't have to go too far to get medical care, but you want to be far enough that you don't want to have to worry about cannonballs sailing through wherever you are. You don't want to get hit again. Now, it's here that the surgical procedures tend to happen. What you see here, of course, is what comes to mind for a lot of people when they think about Civil War medicine, the amputation. That's because it was the most common surgical procedure of the Civil War. There were 60,000 amputations performed during the conflict, 15,000 a year, which is a staggering number when you think about it. And we get a lot of questions at the museum, why did there have to be so many? Doesn't that seem like sort of a waste? Well, that has everything to do with the type of ammunition they're using during the Civil War. The mini ball, the lead mini ball, when it strikes human bone, it's going to shatter the bone as opposed to breaking it or fracturing it. If anyone's ever broken bones out there, which I certainly don't hope anybody has, but if you have, I'm going to guess, I certainly hope it was a clean break or a fracture. With that, you put a cast on, don't bang it into a wall. It sort of puts itself back together. The human body is pretty amazing. But a shattered bone needs a little bit more help than that. You need screws and plates and pins, and it's a whole ordeal in addition to a cast that they're just not equipped to deal with during the Civil War. We have a couple sets of Civil War era casts in the museum. So they know how to set broken bones. The injuries that they're dealing with are just beyond their skill to heal at the time. So amputation is what they turn to more often than not. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, 95% of all Civil War surgery uses anesthesia. That's what the person on the right there is doing, administering the anesthesia, just a few drops of chloroform or ether into a little cone situation or even just a rag, and the patient's out. Now, how likely are you to survive one of these amputations? Well, that depends. And again, I'm not a medical person, but this kind of makes sense to me. The further away from the core of your body, the more likely you are to survive an amputation. Makes sense, right? So if you lose a finger or a toe, you only have about a 2 or 3% mortality rate. So you'll almost certainly be fine. All the way up to, if you lose a leg at the hip, that is an 83% mortality rate. And that was high enough that some doctors wouldn't even do the procedure, but just gives you an idea of the range. If you average it all out, it's about a 26% mortality rate for amputations during the Civil War. Not bad, not great. It sounds a little bit better, though, when you compare it to the mortality rate for civilian amputations before the Civil War, and that was 50%. So you're twice as likely to survive an amputation during the Civil War as you would have been before the Civil War. And that, I think, has a lot to do with the Letterman plan, the Letterman system, quickly and efficiently getting people, wounded soldiers, into the hospitals and the procedures happening fast. I think that has a lot to do with it. So from the field hospital, soldiers would be taken typically by rail to the final step of the Letterman plan, the general hospital. Now, these are purpose-built hospitals that are constructed in larger cities, your Richmonds, your DCs, your Philadelphias. Now, these hospitals did not exist at the start of the Civil War. The largest military hospital at the start of the Civil War only had 40 beds and was in Kansas. That's not going to cut it in a war that sees over 1 million woundings. We need more than a 40-bed facility. And so these newly constructed hospitals have thousands of beds. And in fact, the largest military hospital gets built in Philadelphia, Satterley Hospital. Now, you don't see any of these anymore. Well, Satterley and I think Mower General Hospital, both in Philadelphia, they both hold 3,000 or 4,000 patients. And you don't see any of these places anymore because they were, all made out of wood. And basically, as soon as the Civil War is done, they're like, well, don't need these anymore. And they tear them down immediately after the Civil War is over, which is kind of shocking to me every time I think about it, because, I mean, I don't know, why wouldn't you keep those around? But they decide they don't need them now that the war is over. So that's why you don't see these things anywhere, really. Now, these general hospitals are interesting places, I think. Here we see some of the early applications of the scientific method in the United States. Doctors are aware that these diseases are a problem. I mean, the goal of any doctor is to help the patient survive, but the fact that all these diseases have mortality rates mean that to some degree they were unsuccessful. And so they study these things and they say, how can we prevent the spread? How can we treat these better? How can we do this? And so they apply hypotheses, or whatever the plural of that is. They test theories and such, and they record their data. All of these numbers that I'm kind of throwing at you come to us from the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. It's all for free, available online, text searchable. It's an incredible resource. If you try and read it front to back, you'll probably fall asleep. It reads a bit like an encyclopedia or worse, but the information in there is invaluable. And so that's how we know a lot of this stuff. So they're running all these tests, and they start to figure some things out, actually. They start to discover that cleanliness seems to be correlated with good health. So they require that all patients be cleaned every single day, their clothes cleaned every single day, their bed sheets cleaned every single day. They don't know why that this is a thing that is the case, but they're trying to save lives, so it becomes policy at these places. Likewise, they require that windows be kept open at all times because they start to notice that good airflow seems to be helpful. As we've been discovering over the past year and a half or so, the importance of airflow. They don't know why this is a thing, but they're doing it. They're trying to, again, save lives. And then the kind of goofiest thing in that regard, which you see the pine branches hanging from the ceiling. This image was not taken during Christmas time. They figure that things that smell good seem to be better than things that smell bad. So they'll just make it smell good all the time. They're trying. And so because of all of this, if you squint a little bit, they're getting close to discovering germ theory. They're kind of right there, but they just don't quite make it in the end. But because of all these policies, the mortality rate at these general hospitals is quite low. It's only about 7%. So if you make it back to one of these facilities, you're probably going to be fine. Now, the Letterman plan that I just kind of went through with these previous stops, the Letterman plan is still used by our military today. The skeleton of it, anyway. I mean, we have, instead of horse-drawn ambulances and wagons, we have helicopters and motorized vehicles. We know about germ theory. We're better in so many ways, but the structure of medical evacuation and caring for patients in a systemized way is still with us today, and it comes directly from the Civil War. Now, what happens after the Letterman system? Prosthetic limbs, in a war that sees over 60,000 amputations, the prosthetic limb industry does quite well. And if you're a Union soldier, the federal government will pay for your prosthetic limb. If you're a Confederate soldier, tough luck, don't rebel against the federal government, but the state government for which you fought might help you out in that regard. And just to give you an idea of how widespread this issue was, in 1866, the year after the Civil War, 100% of the state budget of the state of Mississippi was dedicated for prosthetic limbs for veterans. I mean, it was a staggeringly huge issue. Now, in a war that saw over 750,000 deaths, there were bound to be a few cases of what we would call today PTSD. Now, at the time of the Civil War, they don't have the language to deal with this. And, you need to do some creative reading back through the sources. They identify, or they, cite symptoms that we would associate today with PTSD. They diagnose it as nostalgia, old soldier's disease, irritable heart. It goes by many names, but the story for those people generally ends unhappily, and they mostly wind up in insane asylums. What does help them, though, is if they join the veterans organizations that get founded in the years after the Civil War, the Grand Army of the Republic for Union veterans and the United Confederate Veterans for Confederate veterans. And the reunions and the meeting up to talk end up, offering some degree of kind of therapy. They're not thinking about it that way, but it's sort of a therapeutic exercise for the veterans. For those that don't make it through the end of the war, embalming is more often the fate if their body is to be shipped back home to be buried in the family plot. And embalming and embalming surgeons, embalmers follow the armies sort of like locusts. They were oftentimes sort of private entities that you could contract out if you wanted your family member's body shipped home. The person you see in the image there is Dr. Richard Burr, and he actually operated out of the building where the museum is actually located in Frederick, Maryland. That was his sort of base of operations. So we were kind of an embalming hub for the armies who were passing to and fro from Frederick. So as we sort of come to a close here, Civil War medicine, it's not modern medicine. It shouldn't be confused for that. But it's not this kind of pre-modern barbaric thing that sometimes it's made out to be. Rather, it occupies what I think anyway is sort of an interesting middle ground between the two. And it kind of lays the foundation for a lot of the kind of modern medical practices that we know of and benefit from today. So that's all I have for the formal part of my program here. I'm happy to stick around and take questions and chat with you all.
Okay, well, thanks, Sean. We really appreciate that. It's a lot of neat insight there, a lot of things I didn't know about. I would like to introduce you to Gus Spector. You can probably see his picture there. He's a doctor from Philadelphia area. He's been very involved with all this kind of stuff. So we've touched on a few of the things like the Sanitary Commission, and he has a lot of knowledge and information about that. So he's been our source. So hopefully, just to get you guys get to know each other a little bit. That's cool. So great resource for us. So any questions for John?
Sure, John. How were the doctors treated? Were they officers like now, and were they organized in some kind of way?
Yeah, they were sort of their own. The medical department was kind of its own entity within the Army. The surgeons were officers, and they were kind of different ranks within that. I forget the equivalencies, but you had full surgeon, you had assistant surgeons, and you had hospital stewards. That was sort of the ranking. And again, I forget the equivalency. And the full surgeons at least would have kind of a ceremonial sword, like some of the officers were. I want to say that a full surgeon was equivalent to a major, or maybe one step below that. But so they were considered officers, and they occupied kind of a curious place. I mean, they were certainly under the authority of the regimental commanders and things like that, but they themselves had authority to kind of order some of the privates and things of that nature. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a comment. I just recently finished reading Days of Darkness about the Gettysburg battle, and they, just because of the sheer magnitude of injuries, they couldn't do it within 2 days, like I said. But they had field hospitals and all that sort of thing. They used anesthesia and the whole bit, but they also had 75 buildings, including a lot of homes that were used. And they used a lot of washing in the homes themselves because they could do it. They had their own wells in the backyard and all that.
Right.
So that book goes into that sort of thing pretty heavily, and it's taken from the people who actually lived there and kept diaries. So
Right. Yeah, that's cool. I'll have to look into that.
Days of Darkness. You can go to Gettysburg at the Visitors Museum, Visitor Center, and they have for sale.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, fresh water was a vitally important thing that doctors would look for in identifying, field hospitals and things. So, access to a creek, or in this case, as you mentioned, wells and such. That was vitally important, not just, of course, for drinking water, but water was often used in bandaging. I mean, they did believe in sort of, if they weren't going to, perform some surgery on it, it was just sort of like a soft tissue wound. They believe pretty heavily in cleaning the wound, not necessarily with soap, but just kind of cleaning it such that when they put the bandage on it, it at least didn't appear dirty. It would be considered dirty by doctors and surgeons today, but that was how they thought of it. So water was a vitally important point, or important part of Civil War medical care.
The townspeople also didn't differentiate between where they were from, Union or Confederacy, because they just wanted to help a human being, and that was the amazing thing about the civilians during the battle.
Yeah, well, and in many ways they didn't really have much of a choice, because it's not like they can go anywhere. But yes, you're right. You're right to say that, generally speaking, the doctors were and nurses and etc. were pretty good at being impartial.
So is that something you guys emphasize too, that you brought up about the nurses? It's easy to talk about the surgeons and the assistant surgeons and things, but so I assume there wasn't a large contingency, like what we look at, like Clara Barton, or how many female nurses were there, and how many male nurses, or people that are listed maybe that the doctors used as assistants and things. Do you guys have that kind of stuff at the museum too?
Yeah, we have some displays on nursing care. So nursing as a profession just did not exist at the time of the Civil War. Nursing, as we think of it, just wasn't around, and so you could not sign up to be a part of the medical corps as a nurse. So what we would probably consider to be male nurses were other convalescing patients, just other wounded soldiers who were there. Now, there was a pretty robust group of women, many of whom were unpaid, but some of which were paid, were paid a salary, who acted in nursing capacities. Dorothea Dix is sort of one of the famous ones. She was the superintendent of Army nurses, and she led a grouping of about 2,000 who were paid a salary to go and be nurses in hospitals, around the North. I don't know of any other paid model in the South, but there was a pretty vast cadre of volunteer nurses, both North and South. And there's a fantastic book, which I can't recommend enough. It's called Women at the Front by Jane Schultz. And she identifies, now she uses the term nurse quite broadly, she says, referring to, everyone from, someone like Clara Barton all the way down, to like cooks and laundresses who, might not actually be doing medical care on the patients, but they're kind of facilitating hospital work in a broad way. So she defines nurses quite broadly, but she identifies that there were 22,000 Union women nurses alone, and her study was on Union nurses. So I think it's safe to say there was a comparable number in the Confederacy, maybe a touch less, but so there's tens of thousands of women who go to the front and participate in this whole enterprise.
There was that book I read was also a convent in Emmitsburg. It sent women up to be nurses, basically. And after the battle, Clara Barton was involved in getting help and aid to those who were still in Gettysburg and still injured. So Clara Barton had something to do with that. I don't know. I don't recall whether she actually visited there, but
She did not during
no.
all of 1860, or, well, not all, but the overwhelming majority of 1863, she was actually in South Carolina.
Yeah, but she kind of helped organize out of Philadelphia to get trains to bring supplies in for the wounded after the battle, and that went on for several months actually.
Mm-hmm.
So we philatelists know about the sanitary fairs. They made stamps. But did the word sanitary mean something? You know, we interpret it to mean killing germs. So did it mean something different in those days?
To my understanding, it mostly meant to just broadly speaking, it was generally speaking clean. It's not clean or sanitary as we would think of it, but just generally clean.
I had a comment you mentioned about quinine. It turns out that it may be a good cure for some things, but quinine itself is severely ototoxic. I've had patients that have had quinine therapy, and it turns your mastoid bone basically into Swiss cheese.
Oh dear.
And yeah, that's not good for your hearing. And the cure for that, believe it or not, is a mastoidectomy, which when you feel the patients behind their ear where your mastoid bone is on both sides, it feels like the surgeon had just taken a melon baller and scooped it out, because that's basically what they did. Now, a lot of people think we hear through our ears, and we do, but we can also hear with the mastoid bone. It doesn't have to go through the outer ear, middle ear, and inner ear, but we can hear with the mastoid bone, and there are mastoid bone transducers for those people that have outer, middle, inner ear problems or a nerve problem, whatever it may be, maybe even tumors, which can be life-threatening when they're in the ear as well. But yeah, quinine is severely ototoxic, and I've had plenty of patients, you know, from the 20s and 10s, I mean the 19s, not recently, but yeah, you know, you went to feel back there to feel, and you could feel the hole where that melon baller had been. But yeah, that's from quinine. Just an aside, if you will.
Yeah. No, I always love little tidbits like that, you know,
Yeah.
not being a medical person myself. So I appreciate that.
Well, I didn't stay at Holiday Inn last night either, but you know, I know a little bit. Your whole presentation, I must say, has been very interesting. Just while I got you on the horn, but yeah, I'd say that at the end, but it's been very interesting.
Well, good. Thank you so much.
This would be good because I also belong to Orlando's. I'm gonna live outside of Orlando's little old place called Winter Garden, Florida. But I belong to Greater Orlando Civil War Roundtable, and I was thinking this would just be a fantastic talk for a roundtable. Besides postal history. Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, feel free to, you can get my contact information from Steve. You know, we're always happy to do programs like this.
Yeah, and I'll send out the link if you want to share it too, Steve. You know, so for the recording.
I think we've already been down that road from Steve to Steven. He's shared links, so that's how I got this one too.
Right.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. Yes,
of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
From Steve from Steven. But thank you, John. It's been very interesting to say the least. I'll let everybody go now.
Gus, did you have anything there? I saw that. Were you getting some material there? Gus has a treasure trove of stuff behind him there. All that stuff you see there. You're muted, Gus. We just got to get him unmuted.
Okay.
All right.
On the Pennsylvania Postal History Society website, I have two of my presentations, PowerPoint presentations. One's on the hospitals, Philadelphia Army hospitals during the Civil War, and the other is on the sanitary fairs.
I'll put those two in the email so that everybody can see those two, direct links to those. And it might be interesting for you to see too, John.
Absolutely.
Also, are you familiar? It's a little booklet. I don't know if you can see this. Civil War medicine from the Didush
No, it doesn't ring any bells.
Do you familiar with the Didush National Museum of Civil War Medicine?
Well, we are the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, but
This must have been the precursor.
Is it an older book or?
well, yeah, I mean, it could be. We've only been around since
you know-
about 95.
Oh, you know what? It's urologic history. That's why I'm a urologist.
Ah,
Didush was a urologist,
well, there you go.
but it pretty much
We have all different parts of the body, apparently.
echoed. But this booklet echoed pretty much everything that you talked about.
Oh, good. Well, it's always nice to have a little reassurance that I wasn't just making everything up. Just a couple things.
And there were several doctors on here that aren't here anymore too, so they must have been okay. But Stephen, since you brought it up, it's interesting because I always thought about that prosthetic part after the war. You know how that business, probably came into being. I wonder if it was, the same type of thing with like hearing. I don't know if they had hearing aids then, or what happened to those people that probably couldn't hear or were, such loud sounds. I'm sure they lost some of their hearing.
That was the proverbial ear horn.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Oh. So the ear horn business came in.
That was the thing. I would have loved to have had one in my office, just for example, because now they're, teeny tiny and very, very small, very discreet. But I would have loved to have had one like, well, you can either pay this, have this little bitty one, or you can have this.
Right. Well, there's so many things. And that's why I love these kind of presentations and interacting with you guys, because there's things that you just don't think about. It's like, some of these things are unintended consequences or businesses that are built out of things that have happened. I don't know that. I always call them the rabbit holes because I'm on the internet all day, every day. And I see so many Haley's comments, I'm finding new stuff. And one thing I will tell you guys about, I'm also going to put a link. There's a site called Bubble Up, and it's kind of a sharing site. Gus and I use it, and I use it with Vern. I have a ton of information now about Pennsylvania history. I'll just narrow it down to those two words, but it's probably at least 200 or more books, probably more than that, because it's probably 8 gigabytes of stuff that I go on Google Books almost every day and grab different stuff. I have history of all the different counties, and I can't even explain how much stuff is there. But don't think, oh, this is just junk mail. It's kind of worth checking out. It's pretty cool, and it's a resource. You can go there. It's easy to use. There's not too many things that are that easy, but you can go there and you can search through all the different things. You just click on it; it'll open up like the PDF. And I'll anybody that wants to be part of that, I have to just send you an email and add you, as a user. And Gus and I have been doing it, and it's great because you can put comments and things on it too. So it's pretty cool, so we share stuff that way. Okay. Well, anything else? Well, I'd like to thank everybody for being here tonight. I will send out an email tomorrow for everybody to look at the links. And, thank you very much, John. We really appreciated it.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you, John. If you need a letter of recommendation to go to medical school, let us know. And
I can do ears, and we can do something else.
we got urology. I'm a cardiologist. I think we got you covered.
I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well,
Take
great.
care.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Have
Well,
a
this
great
is wonderful. Have a great night,
day. All right, we'll
everybody.
see you next time.
Great presentation.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks for
you very
setting it up, Steve.
Oh, thank you for
Yeah.
being here. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right.